Thank you for staying with us. This is Good Morning Kenya. My name is Vivian Degwa, and right now we get into a very different conversation, and we will be looking at food security as well as food safety. And joining me for that conversation is one Mr. Julius Nyabicha. He is a food safety and food security expert. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Vivian.
You're good this morning?
Good. Yeah, waiting for the State of the Nation address.
Yes.
And I'm sure they're going to talk about food safety and food security.
That's what you're expecting from the president's speech today.
Of course, some of us are experts in this area.
Yeah.
We expect that the president is going to talk about food safety as well as food security. We need to feed our people. Absolutely.
It's a very important conversation for sure. Maybe if you may just get to tell us more about what you do.
Yeah, my name is Julius Nyabicha. I'm a food safety and food security expert. I work with the Cereal Growers Association, CGA, which is a national non-for-profit organization that brings together farmers, smallholder farmers, medium-scale farmers, as well as large-scale farmers. For a long time in this country, we do not have an organization that brings together all these three types of farmers. But it is important to note that the food that we consume, the food production in this country, comes from all these three categories of farmers. We do advocacy and policy. We sit down with the government using evidence that we gather from the field so that we can come up with good policies and the policies that can enable the farmers to produce more and to produce safe food.
Okay.
Other than that, we also do technical backstopping and technical services we offer to our farmers to ensure that at the end of the day, farmers adopt technology and they're able to produce efficiently and effectively, cost-effectively, so that they can undertake farming as a business. We also facilitate the sharing of information between farmers so that at the end of the day, we have farmers that are informed, farmers that can be able to borrow a leaf from the rest of the farmers all over the world and from other counties on what they do. Okay. We have a footprint in 32 counties in this country, and therefore we are serving Kenyan farmers, bringing them together, ensuring that food is produced safely and sufficiently so that we can get to have food to eat as a country.
All right. Even as we get into our topic of conversation today, and as you've mentioned earlier, you're expecting the president to also say something on food security and food safety of the country. Probably what exactly would you love to hear from his speech concerning that?
Yeah, for a long time, this country has not had food security. We import a lot of food. And a country that is not food secure, in many cases, is also not secure in terms of strategic security. And therefore, the moment you ensure that your people are well fed and there is food security, that translates to national security. And that's why I would expect the president to talk more about food security. I know a lot of measures have been put in place, especially the fertilizer subsidy program, which has catalyzed good production. I saw a communique from the CS Agriculture the other day that we have got about 76 million 50 kilo bags of maize in this country right now, which is quite a good improvement. That translates to about 42 million 90 kilogram bags. And we are moving towards food sufficiency, especially when it comes to maize, which is our staple food. But then we need to ask ourselves many questions. What infrastructure do we have to store this food, to preserve this food, so that we have this food in the next 6 months, in the next 1 year, before we do another production? So these are some of the issues that we expect to hear the president talk about on which measures we are putting in place, especially for inputs, which measures we are putting in place for post-harvest handling, through which we are losing about 30% of our produce, especially grains and pulses, which measures we are putting in place to close our porous borders. For instance, right now, there is rumor that a lot of maize is getting through the borders to Uganda, which is not a good sign for us. Once we do the production, once we put a lot of resources, once the government invests in inputs like fertilizer and we do production, we expect that this food first is going to benefit the Kenyan people, before it is exported elsewhere. So we need, as a people, to have a very good balance sheet to evaluate how much do we produce, how much do we export, how much do we import, and if we do not have enough to export, then we can close our borders and say we are not going to export because we do not have food to feed our people. Yep.
So as it is as a country, would you say okay, you've clearly said we are not food secure yet. We are food insecure. Maybe what are some of the determinants of food security?
Some of the issues that make us food insecure are the perennial challenges that we have had. One, we must not close our eyes and sweep it under the carpet that we do not have challenges of climate change. We have climate change that we must now start to address as a country. Yeah. Climate change comes in different forms, and therefore, for instance, as an institution, Cereal Growers Association, we are bringing together farmers, and we are trying now to teach the farmers on climate resilient agriculture. We mitigate the climate change. We are trying to do mixed farming. We are trying to make sure that we are doing regenerative agriculture. We are trying, because if you look at it, for instance, sometimes back in Kitale, it was very easy for you to produce 40, 50 bags of maize per acre. But today, not anymore, because of the effects of climate change. So we must appreciate that we have climate change, that we must, the government should be in the forefront in addressing. Number two, we must also start building a culture of diversification in terms of what we consume. Most of us are so rigid in what we consume. If you do not see ugali on your table, you have not seen food. So as a people, we must also start to diversify on what we consume. And number three, we must start venturing into value chains that are more resilient, especially to climate change. Not just maize, not just rice, not just wheat, but we must now go into probably sweet potatoes, into beans, and other value chains. We must now start to produce where we think we have a comparative advantage. Most of us just produce, for instance, maize in areas that are not fit for maize production. So we must start to do this. Number four, as a people, and probably through the government must start enacting enabling policies. We must sit down with the people, even when we do policies, to make sure that will trickle down to the farmers, and the farmers are going to benefit out of these policies. And most important is the budget allocation. We all understand that agriculture is devolved, but we have not seen that effective development of agriculture. At county level, the officers are not facilitated, there are few not facilitated, and therefore we don't see the extension service provision right down to the farmer. And more budget should be allocated to the Department of Agriculture at the county level, to the Ministry of Agriculture at national level. So these are issues that we must do if indeed we must curb the issue of food insecurity in this country.
In the country.
Yeah.
There's something you touched on, and I want us to get onto that. You touched on diversification, and you mentioned about us not just relying on one thing, and not us being able to diversify in what we also put on our tables as our meals. Maybe what are the potential risks in over-reliance of just one crop when it comes to food security? Because as a country, I think we overly rely on maize. So maybe what are the potential risks on just over-relying on one particular crop for food security?
Yeah, well, when we define food security, actually we talk about 3 or 4 aspects. We talk about availability, is that food available? We talk about affordability, can you afford that food? We talk about nutrition, is that food nutritious? I don't think you can talk about food security if you're talking about only one value chain, about one crop, because it cannot give you sufficient nutrients, and therefore that nutrition part in food security definition is left out. And that's the reason why every time when we talk about food security, we must open up our minds. We must start talking about don't over-rely on one. For instance, if there is a disease, or there are pests and the diseases that will affect that crop, that value chain that you call your staple food, at the end of the day, you might not have it. Let me give you a very good example. Kenya, wheat is, I think, the second most important value chain. Our demand for the country is about 24 million bags. What we produce locally, like our projection for this season, is only 1.7 to 2 million bags. So we have a deficit of 22 million bags that we must import. And where do we import from? We import from Russia, we import from Ukraine, where there is war. So if that's the case, and sometimes you're not able to get this, even if you have money, sometimes you might have your money, but you cannot get the food that you require because of the challenges, because of the dynamics of what's going on in the world. If you don't get that, then what happens? It means that you'll do without that value chain. Or it will become so expensive because of the logistics of getting that food to the country. And that's why we must now start opening up our eyes and saying, instead of talking about wheat, for instance, can we start talking about another value chain? And then, two, can we look for means and ways of increasing our local production? Instead of talking about 1.7 to 2 million bags per year, let us talk about 5 next year, let us go to 10, so that we can start talking about we can produce at least 50% of our local demand for wheat. So that is the danger of over-relying on imports. And I must mention that Kenyans, we have a peculiar behavior of thinking that whatever that is imported is good. We take a lot of pleasure in talking about, I am consuming imported food, which is not a good thing. Let us start being proud of what we produce locally and start consuming what we produce locally. We have our own sorghum, we have our own wheat, we have our own millet, we have our own sweet potatoes. Let us start consuming that. Over and above that, I know the research institutions in this country have done a lot of research, and now we have got very nutritious value chains. Like, for instance, sometimes back, sweet potatoes was not very nutritious, but right now, because of the research and the varieties that have been developed, we've got very nutritious sweet potatoes, which we can consume as a staple food. So let us start opening up our minds, and let us start thinking about and outside the traditional value chains that we call staple foods in this country.
Maybe what challenges would you say we are facing as a country in terms of food security? I know you've talked about climate change, which is something that affects, you know, the entire world, if I may say so. But what other challenges maybe do we face as a country in matters of food security?
One of the challenges that we have faced in this country, especially those of us who are in the sector, is the land tenure system. This is a country where a lot of people have a lot of idle land. And sometimes if you have to lease that land from these people that have it, they will lease it to you maybe for 1 year. In 1 year, you cannot effectively undertake measures that would look into soil health. You cannot invest effectively in soil health when you know that you have this land for 1 year. And therefore, you cannot have long-term investment on this piece of land. So the land tenure system in Kenya should change. If land is for agriculture and an investor is taking up this land, an example is like in France. The minimum is about 9 years if you have to lease land for agricultural purposes. So in Kenya, I think we need to change. If you are leasing land for agricultural purposes, let it be long-term so that you can also be able to invest effectively and probably invest more in soil health. Number two, infrastructure. We do not have sufficient, when you look at Nairobi and maybe in most county headquarters, you see good roads. But when you go deeper and in the rural areas where food production is taking place, the infrastructure is still very poor. Number three, there is something that we call post-harvest loss management and post-harvest handling. In grains and pulses, for instance, we lose up to 30% of what we produce because of poor post-harvest management. The government needs to come in and invest effectively in infrastructure to do with storage, transportation, storage, processing, so that whatever is produced is not lost. We do not lose that 30%. So this is something else that we need to do. This is a big challenge that we must face and we must also tackle. So we have talked about infrastructure. Yeah. We have talked about post-harvest and loss management. We are talking about the land tenure system. And we are talking about extension service provision, which is virtually, we must look at each other and agree that the extension service provision in this country is dead. Actually, the small percentage of that's being given is coming from the private sector. Okay. The non-for-profit organization, the NGOs, plus input companies. And what's the danger of doing that? Input companies, for instance, if they have to give you extension, their extension will be skewed towards their product. It might not be a very balanced extension service that is given to the farmers. It will be skewed towards their product. But the government needs to come in and invest effectively in extension service provision. Finally, we must talk about technology. For a long time, this country has lagged behind when it comes to technology. For instance, there is what we used to call the fertilizer revolution. Many countries across the world embraced the issue of fertilizer. The average use of fertilizer in many countries is about 200 kilos per acre. Come to Kenya, the average use of fertilizer is about 20, 30 kilos per acre. You can see the difference. Yeah. You cannot produce if you do not use sufficient and the right fertilizer. And that's why now we say when we talk about regenerative agriculture, yes, we're using this fertilizer, but now we must start to bring in other issues about mixed farming so that you can be able to get manure, you can be able to see on how to reduce on inorganic fertilizers and come to organic fertilizers. But that is a meticulous process that must be undertaken with care and with time, maybe 10 years, then we should have transitioned. But for now, we are depending on fertilizer. When we talk about technology again, we must talk about biotechnology. Yeah. Seeds, technological advancement. For instance, let me give you an example. We talk so much about GMOs. Yeah. And every time you mention about GMO in this country, it's like people are taken aback. Most people say, that's not a good thing to talk about. But let us open our eyes. Let us demystify some of these technologies. Let us face these technologies with open minds. That when you talk about GMO, for instance, listen to the pros and the cons. Yeah. Let the experts tell you what GMO is before you make a decision. That is important. When we talk about technology again, we are talking about mechanization. Labor is becoming very expensive. So when we talk about mechanization, let us look for means and ways of having, if it's a tractor that is serving a certain village, then it can be moving from one farm to another if we have smallholder farmers. If you've done the harvesting and now you are doing the post-harvest handling, you're threshing your maize, don't stop beating your maize with sticks. Start now having what we call the threshers, that they can be able to move from one farmer to another and doing that efficiently so that we reduce on post-harvest losses. That is what we call a technology. And at the end of the day, if we put that together, then we have a farmer that is well enabled. And finally, when we talk about farming in Kenya, it's a whole value chain. The agribusiness value chain is long. There is the production bit. Yeah. There are those that are giving you the inputs. There are those that are giving you the agrochemicals, taking care of the crops on the farm. There are those that are handling the harvesting bit, the post-harvesting bit, those who are doing the value addition, and finally your food on the table. When we talk about a Kenyan farmer, let us not think about a Kenyan farmer as that person that is doing the actual production, growing. you can, especially the young people, the youth and the women, along these nodes on the agribusiness value chain, you can get yourself there. You could be that is offering the inputs and advisory and at that level. You are a farmer. You could be aggregating after the harvesting has been done and putting it, your produce together for the off-takers. That is farming. You could be developing an app that will help the farmers in terms of digitization. That is still farming. You could be that who is doing processing that is still within the agribusiness value chain. And therefore, let us see where we can play. Not everybody can be in actual production, but let us see how to bring the youth. And finally, I wanted to tell you, one of the major challenges that we have in this country is the aging population of the Kenyan farmer. We need to bring the youth to agriculture. Agriculture is a science. Agriculture is very dynamic. It's a dynamic science that we need to bring the youth so that they can be able to start engaging and taking over. And how do we do that? Many ways. Make agriculture a bit sexy. Make it a bit attractive. Let us bring the apps into agriculture. Let us mechanize agriculture. Let us have the youth get themselves into areas that are more exciting for them. Let them develop the apps for agriculture. And let us stop portraying agriculture as something that is a fallback plan when you have lost everything, when you don't have anything. No. A lot of young people today are making a lot of money from agriculture, and therefore let us make agriculture a bit younger, as it were.
Okay. And on that note, we'll take a break. Don't go too far. We'll be back to continue with this conversation. And Mr. Julius had mentioned to me that Tanzania is food secure at the moment. So what is it that they're doing right that we can emulate as a country in order to get to that status as well? Don't you go too far. We'll be back in a bit. Welcome back. And before we took that break, Mr. Julius was just speaking about us ensuring that we kind of modernize agriculture in order for it to be appealing to the younger generation. And you also mentioned, you know, when you talk about agriculture, we're not just talking about the farming bit of it. There's a whole spectrum of it, and that is what should be sold to the younger people maybe, so that they can also get into or jump onto this industry that is the agriculture industry. And I also mentioned that you had talked to me about Tanzania being food secure as it is at the moment, a status that we are yet to achieve. So maybe what are they doing right? And what are some things that we can borrow from them in order for us to also get to that status? Yeah,
Vivian, many times we get food, we import our food from Tanzania, particularly maize, beans, rice. We import from Tanzania, fruits, a lot of horticultural produce we also import from Tanzania. But why is Tanzania food secure and we are not? Why is Tanzania having a food surplus and we are having a food deficit? I have worked in Tanzania as an expatriate for about 8 years. So I can be able to compare what happens in Tanzania and what happens in Kenya. The first thing I think about is policy. Tanzania, at policy level, I've got a very enabling and a consistent agricultural policy. For instance, in 2009, they came up with what they call Kilimo Kwanza, agriculture first policy. And that has gone through, it does not matter what regime, that is a policy that they have, that agriculture has to be given its fair it's on a fair place on the table. And they have consistently done that, putting agriculture first. And how do they do it? One, they've got a very vibrant research system, and they actually make use of what they get from research. In Kenya, we have a tendency of having very savvy research institutions by the government, funded by the government. But what we get from those research institutions does not transit to the commercial, to the market. So in Tanzania, they make sure that whatever has been researched get to the market. The government is very supportive. The extension service is still working, and they invest heavily on extension. Number two, Tanzania is more climate resilient when it comes to climate as compared to Kenya. If you look at this country, many parts of the lower eastern and the northeastern part of this country, it's very dry. It's almost it's semi-arid. But in Tanzania, most parts are still having enough rainfall, and they are not as dry as Kenya. Why? Because they take care of the environment, and this is where it is most important. Tanzanians are very good in taking care of the environment. If you were to drive from Arusha to Dar es Salaam, to whatever destination, it is like you'll be driving through a forest. So they take care of the environment, and the environment is taking care of themselves. The land use and the land tenure system, I've already talked about it, that it is one of our undoing in Kenya. In Tanzania, land is owned by the government, and you can get long-term leases if you want to invest in agriculture. Not in Kenya, where land is very privatized. And if you want to get probably even idle land for agriculture, it's very hard for you to do that. Infrastructure. Tanzanians have invested very well in rural infrastructure because that's where agriculture takes place. Kenya has invested very well in infrastructure, and especially in urban areas. But we are thanking the devolution. The county governments are now doing a great job when it comes to infrastructure and upgrading the rural roads for this to happen. Another issue is that Tanzania is very good in keeping their food balance sheet. They cannot export a single grain if they know that they do not have enough for their country. Kenya, I don't think we are very keen on that. Sometimes we export even when we do not have enough in the country. So they are very good. They take care of their borders. The borders are not porous, and they ensure that they have enough food in their country before they can export. Something else that they do is diversification of value chains, which we don't do in Kenya, especially food. Deliberately, they know that if you do not have enough food, you do not have dignity. It does not matter how much money you have, but if you have no food, you have no dignity at all. So in Tanzania, they have given priority to production of food, rice, self-sufficient, and actually exporting to Kenya. Self-sufficient in maize, with a lot of surplus, which they export to Kenya, and many other value chains, horticultural produce, they've got stuff. But Kenya, when you look at it, we have put so much emphasis on tea, we're putting so much emphasis on coffee, on horticultural produce meant for export, at the expense of our food production. I would, if I were in the policy-making table, on the policy-making table, I would start thinking seriously about food production and food security. I have already said it. There is a very thin line between food security and national security. So our food security is not doing very well, and Tanzania is doing very well. So their research and the way they look at food production is totally different. They have got a very good balance sheet. They know what's getting out of the country, what's in the country. Their data is savvy. They've got very good data. They know how much is produced, how much is projected to be produced, how much the country needs. For instance, a few years ago, I knew that Tanzania would produce 6 million tons of maize. Their local consumption, 4.5 to 5 million tons of maize, and therefore what was allowed to go out of the country is only 1.5, about 1 to 1.5 million metric tons. That's how serious Tanzania is. And that's why when we look at it, then we say Kenya, we have some ground to cover to make ourselves food secure. But something else that you must also think about, this thing that we call urbanization. There is Kenya, there is a lot of urbanization. The bigger percentage of our people are getting urbanized. When you get urbanized, move from rural to urban areas, you don't engage in food production. But your demand for food is more. You know the reason why we say, for instance, if your population increases from 20 million to 40 million, it does not mean that you will double the food production. No. Your food production will be exponential, because when you move from rural to urban area, your diet changes. You consume more animal products. It takes 8 times more water to produce animal products as compared to plant-based products. You woke up in the morning today, you probably took a sausage, some eggs, but the rural folk probably took porridge and sweet potatoes, all plant-based products. So you have already consumed 8 times more. You put 8 times more pressure to the production resources as compared to the rural folk. It will come to your lunch. You'll probably take chicken and something and maybe meat. Again, animal-based products. Come to your dinner the same. The rural folk might take beans and ugali for lunch, exerting less pressure on production resources of our food. So the more you urbanize, the more animal-based food you take, and the more pressure you put on the on production of our food. And that is why we say, the more you urbanize, the more you need to produce, and it's not a linear correlation, it's exponential. I hope that is understood.
Yeah, I'm getting it.
Yeah, that is very tricky, and that's where most people don't get it. That we are becoming more urbanized. We are not only moving away from the production, but we are also exerting more pressure, because now we are eating more animal products as compared to plant-based products, and exerting more pressure.
8 more times.
8 more times.
When it comes to the production of it.
8 more times water to produce 1 kilo of meat, as compared to 1 kilo of grains, maybe maize or beans. That's how bad it is.
Okay, that's new information to me, and I'm sure it's also new information to a lot of people. Well, you know, still on that, malnutrition, unfortunately, still remains a huge challenge in some parts of this country. Unfortunately, you know, in this day and age, we still have malnutrition as a problem, you know, in some parts of the country. Probably, you know, or rather, you know, yes, the buck stops with the government, but also we need to stop this mentality of Serikali's idea all the times, right? So what should be done in order to empower the communities to be able to improve their own food security as a community, without looking at, oh, the government needs to do that, it needs to do this or that? How responsible should we be just as a community in order for us to ensure our own food security?
Vivian, a very good question. There is what we call hidden hunger in this country, and in many parts of the world, in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Hidden hunger means you could have food, you eat, you fill your tummy, but it is not nutritious food. And there is a lot of hidden hunger in this country. The food we take is not nutritious. That's why research must be undertaken to ensure that when you give, for instance, maize, it is maize that contains just more than starch, that contains something else, that you can be able, even for the rural poor people, when they take that food, it's food that is good for them. That is the reason why, for instance, Cereal Growers Association, CGA, we have embarked on a project to promote what we call high iron beans. High iron beans, these are beans which are very high on zinc and iron, meaning that beans is not a very expensive food. Even anybody can be able to access beans. So anybody accessing these beans can be able to have nutritious food and plenty of it, as it were, so that when we define food security, we are talking about nutrition, which we talked about. So this food has to be nutritious. It has got to be affordable. It's also affordable. It has got to be available anytime it's required. And it has to have a component of stability, that it's consistently there, not there this season and next season is not there. So we are investing a lot in coming up with nutritious foods. Number 2, post-harvest handling and management. The moment some foods are infested, then they do not become, they lose their nutritive value. Let me give you an example. Sometimes you can go to some areas of this country which are the bread basket, but you can still find stunted children. Why? This is because of aflatoxin. Aflatoxin, either in maize or in groundnuts, will make the children get stunted without you knowing that this is the cause of aflatoxin. So unless we have very good, meticulous handling processes, post-handling processes of our grains and pulses, we can still have nutritional issues through poor post-harvest handling. And that's why every time when we talk about aflatoxin and measures to control aflatoxin, it is a whole value chain from planting to harvesting to processing to the table. And therefore, it is not left on one partner. It has got to be a whole value chain. All the partners have got to be brought on board. Those that do the planting, those that do the harvesting, the transportation. Somebody can do a very good job at planting, at harvesting, but the person that's doing the transportation does a poor job, and therefore aflatoxin sets in. Or the person doing processing, aflatoxin sets in. So we must have it as an education that transcends throughout the whole value chain, that people get to understand that at the end of the day, we need safe food, and that's where now food safety comes. So there is a very thin line between food security and food safety. Food safety simply means taking food that is contaminated, that will bring you foodborne diseases. You can have a lot of food, but it's contaminated food. At the end of the day, it's poison you are taking and not food. Because our narrative and our slogan is, your food is your medicine. Chakula chako ni dawa yako. Lakini ikiwa chakula chako kina sumu, sasa chakula kinageuka kinakuwa ni sumu. So if your food is supposed to be your medicine, but your food is contaminated, so that food now turns out to be your poison. So it is also a shame that in most parts of this country, you see nutritional deficiencies and you see stunting because of poor post-harvest handling and also because of taking food that's not very nutritious under what we call hidden hunger.
All right. And maybe, I don't know, but I don't know if you've answered my question on communities and what responsibility they have upon themselves to just ensure that they are also just food secure upon themselves as, you know, in the smallest of groups.
This is what we have done, for instance. Let me give you a very good example of what Cereal Growers Association, where I work, what we have done. We have a very good model that we call the Farmers Service Center. You go to a rural area, you pick the lead farmers, and you capacity build them, you train them, so that they can be the agents of change of the rest of the community. You give them enough education, you train them on how to acquire quality inputs, on how to use the inputs, on how to aggregate when it comes to harvesting, on how to do value addition, and on how to build economic resilience among themselves. So once we have built enough of this, then they can cascade the same to the rest of the farmers. That's how you enable community at community level. So the Farmers Service Center model, which is a model by the Cereal Growers Association, is a model that enables and capacity builds and builds resilience with the rural farmers, so that even in the absence of what we call the normal extension service from the government, they still have their own extension service that they can be able to rely on, and they can be able now to tap from one another. And we are also putting these farmers into groups so they can get to learn from one another. And at the end of the day, even if it means give them loans and insuring them, they are insurable because they're in groups, and they're loanable because they're in groups. And at the end of the day, this information remains with the community. Okay. Yeah.
And as we come to an end of this conversation, maybe we can finish off with, when we're talking about food safety, maybe are there measures, good measures put in place in, to track and even recall unsafe food products? From where you sit? Are there good measures for that as we wind up?
I know there is a bill. I have sat through that bill. Personally, there is a bill that is being enacted on food safety. And one of the issues that we look at on food safety is traceability. it's going to be a key issue that the food you're consuming, can you trace it from where it was produced? So traceability is extremely important. Going forward, the food you consume is going to be traced from where it was produced. Okay. Number two, we are also looking at issues of food safety keenly because it impacts economically. For instance, if you took your maize from Kenya and you want to export it and get to the border, it has got aflatoxin, it comes back, you lose that market. And once you lose the market, then the radar is on you. You might not be able to export again. So that is a loss. We are looking at it because of there is a thin line between the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Health. We need to bring these two ministries together so that we can see on how to work together to trace and to see how food safety is impacting on our health sector. So all these are things that we are putting together and trying to look at how do we really ensure that food safety is guaranteed, the food that we are eating, the food that we are taking on the table. Sometimes I see you air some skuma wiki produced in very unfamiliar circumstances. That's the traceability we are talking about. Okay. How to use agrochemicals responsibly, which ones are supposed to be used, which ones are supposed to be pulled off the market. All those issues now fall under food safety.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation and just shedding light on this very, very important discussion, because our food security is just as important. It is a matter of national, okay, I've lost my words. Yeah, of national importance. So thank you so much. That was Mr. Julius Nyabicha, and he is a food safety and food security expert. And he's just gotten to tell us more about food security so that we get to understand what we need to do as a country in order for us to get to the status where we are food secure. Remember, the president will be giving his State of the Nation or the State of the Nation address. This will be his second one, and that will be taking place in the Parliament buildings at around 2:30 p.m. So you better keep it right here, KBC Channel 1, as we will be keeping you up to tabs with that. My name is Vivian Dago, and this is where we get to end Good Morning Kenya for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Do enjoy the rest of your viewing. Goodbye.